Hello, and welcome back to the case study series at DPR. Today we will delve into the dangers of judging one's character before all the facts are known and the impact acting based on unsubstantiated beliefs could have, whether intended or not. Let's look at a case where a search of an accused's home was conducted and literature was discovered that some found odd and disturbing. I will note that the books in question were not illegal and are available through typical marketplaces such as Amazon and online bookstores. The case study focuses on how this literature was used in a bail hearing by the Crown to state that the accused may be a threat to society if he were to be released. Perceptions and judgments formed before a person can give their perspective on a situation can be damaging because they may not be accurate or complete. When these perceptions and judgments are presented to others or expressed to the person in question, it can lead to misunderstandings, conflicts, and negative consequences. For example, in a workplace setting, if a manager forms a negative perception of an employee before hearing their perspective on a situation, they may make decisions that are detrimental to the employee's career and the company's performance. Similarly, in a social setting, if someone forms a negative perception of a person before getting to know them, they may miss out on a valuable friendship or connection. Another example is in a court of law. If the prosecution perceives the defendant as guilty before hearing their defense, it can lead to wrongful convictions. On August 1, 1966, Charles Whitman committed a heinous act of violence, brutally murdering 16 innocent people and injuring 32 others at the University of Texas in Austin. His actions were those of a monster, a cold-blooded killer who took the lives of innocent individuals without a second thought. But as more information about Charles Whitman's life came to light, a different story emerged. It was revealed that he had been a former U.S. Marine, a man who had served his country with honor. He had been a good citizen, respected by those who knew him. However, in the months leading up to the shooting, he had begun to experience severe headaches and had been complaining of suicidal thoughts. It was also found that Charles Whitman had left a note stating that he had been planning the shooting for months, and though he did not want to harm anyone, he felt compelled beyond his control to follow through. He felt he had been troubled by various physical and emotional illnesses. He also wrote that he hoped that an autopsy would reveal a physical reason for his actions so that his family would not blame themselves for what he had done. The autopsy revealed a tumor on his brain, which some experts believe could have contributed to his aggressive behavior and lack of impulse control. Does this raise the question, was Charles Whitman indeed a monster, as one would initially conclude, or was he a man whose actions were influenced by factors beyond his control? The truth is that it is impossible to know for sure. But one thing is certain, Charles Whitman's actions were a tragic consequence of a society that failed to address his mental health issues adequately and a failure to recognize the warning signs that were present. It serves as a reminder that every individual, regardless of their actions, is a complex being with struggles and challenges. It is a call to action for society to do better in addressing mental health issues, recognizing warning signs, and providing proper care for struggling individuals. It is also a call to action to consider the responsibility of society and the state to reduce the stigma that currently deters individuals from seeking assistance. Compassion and recognition that mental health is a continuum on a spectrum and not simply good, poor, healthy, or sick is essential in this effort and cannot be fixed through punishment and imposed hardship when it is of no fault of the sufferer. Current judicial policy dictates the segregation of these individuals from normal members of society into inhumane isolation and living conditions, and they are treated as lesser than. We fail to acknowledge that it is often larger systemic issues within our society that condition beliefs and pressures, causing distress within the segregated person. Denying funding and support for illnesses that can't be physically seen and only treating physical illness has led society to treat these ailments that, again, are of no fault of the sufferer by separating them and imposing punishment. No one would choose to be mentally ill and receive this treatment. As we reflect on the tragic events of August 1, 1966, let us not see Charles Whitman as a monster, but instead as a reminder of the consequences of neglecting the well-being of our fellow human beings. Now, let us set the scene of the bail hearing for the accused, as seen from his eyes as a 40-year-old with no experience in the judicial system and had never been in trouble with the law before this incident. I'll point out that the charges revolved around the possession and importation of a small quantity, less than 10, of electric conducting devices known as stun guns, 2 of which were labeled as firearms. There was also a small quantity of two Schedule I substances found in the accused's school backpack during the police search. It has become evident that the community's safety has been called into question should the accused not be held in segregation due to the discovery of a 7-book autographed collector's series of literature he had acquired and possessed in his residence. The books in question were written by a chemist, Steve Prazel, better known by his pen name, Uncle Fester. Mr. Prazel started writing his first book on a prison typewriter in protest of the policies of his era during incarceration. Back to the present, based on the titles of the books, the courtroom occupants agreed that the subjects were disturbing and that there was no logical reason for anyone to own books harboring these titles. A series of participants in the bail hearing jointly displayed their confusion and concern for the accused's mental state. Having owned this literature and fearing an indication that the accused intended to employ this knowledge to impose harm. Both sides expressed bewilderment, denoting any other reasoning as inexplicable. All were in agreement that a psychological assessment was deemed necessary in conjunction with concurrent counseling to figure out the why and attempt to reform a troubled mind with a history of mental illness. A further suggestion is that a full forensic psychological risk assessment and analysis be performed to determine if reintegration into society would be possible while keeping the public's best interest in mind. The accused was present during this display of concern, seated in a booth visible through clear plexiglass, wearing handcuffs and clothing from 9 days previous without being afforded, despite multiple requests, an opportunity to shave and make his appearance presentable for the hearing that would determine the state of his pending freedom. It's not clear if the disdainful looks he got during the theatrical discussion about the books were because of bias or because of how he looked. Still, they were received with the accused's bewilderment to hear himself being discussed in this manner and portrayed in such a dark way. Now that the scene has been set, let us take a quick detour to add some parallel references to the accused having collected these books and other behaviors members of our society similarly engage in. It is essential to compare and contrast the following of Uncle Fester with other more disturbing happenings that many individuals choose to immerse themselves in. For example, the anti-queer violence and heinous murders committed by Bruce MacArthur are a devastating reminder of the harm that can be inflicted on society. MacArthur's actions caused immense pain and suffering for the victims and their loved ones. We will soon see how society finds it acceptable to follow crimes of this nature. In contrast, the following of Uncle Fester is much less harmful and is not a direct cause of violence or harm. Furthermore, it is essential to consider how society also engages in the consumption of true crime, such as through the popular murder podcast Uncover, which is funded by the Canadian government and produced by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, as well as My Favorite Murder, which may also glamorize violence and criminal behavior. True crime podcasts have become very popular in recent years, with many people listening to hear about different crimes and learn more about them. A YouGov survey finds nearly half of Americans say they enjoy true crime content and a third consume it at least once a week. That includes 24% who say they consume it multiple times per week. Only 30% say they never consume true crime content. True crime podcasts are one of the top 10 most popular types of podcasts in Canada, and many people listen to them regularly. Again, the podcast Uncover is produced by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and funded by the Canadian government. This podcast has a large following and has been lauded as a must-listen true crime and murder podcast by media outlets such as Canadian Reader's Digest. Season 3, having 8 episodes plus a bonus episode, boasts. For years, Toronto's gay village worried a serial killer was in their midst. Men were disappearing from the neighborhood, but police insisted there was no evidence of foul play. Then, in January 2018, police arrested Bruce MacArthur for the murders of 8 men. Police are now reopening dozens of unsolved murders from the village dating back to 1975. Journalist Justin Ling has covered this story for over 5 years, and now he's going back to shed light on these long-forgotten murders. Another example is the podcast My Favorite Murder, which has a large following in Canada and globally. As of 2020, the podcast gets 35 million downloads per month. The podcast's hosts, Karen Kilgariff and Georgia Hardstark, have been praised for their storytelling abilities, and the podcast has been credited for starting the Murderino movement. Other popular true crime podcasts are consumed by Canadians, such as the first podcast ever to reach 5 million downloads, Serial, and with more than 743 million total downloads, Sword and Scale, also Casefile, and Criminal. Some engage the audience with questions such as, which race do you prefer the murder victims to be? It's also worth noting that while true crime podcasts can provide an in-depth understanding of criminal cases and the criminal justice system, they can also have a significant impact on the communities affected by these crimes and potentially romanticize violence and criminal behavior. It is crucial to consider the ethical implications of consuming this type of content and the impact it may have on the victims and their families. It is also essential to consider the societal context of different forms of consumption and not to judge individuals based on one possession or interest. Uncle Fester's books may be controversial, but they do not directly cause harm and should not be used to stigmatize those who possess them. The Accused is a social science student who owns a series of books by Steve Praisel. This is a good addition to their academic research library. These books provide a unique and in-depth understanding of various social and political issues. Suppose we pause to think about why someone studying social science may decide to have this literature in their collection. In that case, we will see that these books directly relate to the topics social science encompasses. Historical significance. Steve Praisel's books were written during a specific period and reflect the social and political climate of that time. A social science student may be interested in understanding how the war on drugs and the criminalization of certain substances impacted society. Freedom of speech and freedom of information. These books were written as a form of protest and as an advocate for freedom of speech and freedom of information. Study of social movements. Steve Praisel's books can be seen as a part of a larger social movement that challenges government policies and the criminalization of certain substances. Study of drug policy. Steve Praisel's books give people a deep understanding of how illegal drugs are made and how drug policies affect society. Study of crime and deviance. Steve Praisel's books help people understand why certain things are made illegal and how that affects society. Study of social inequality. Steve Praisel's books help people understand how certain policies and criminalization hurt marginalized groups more than others. Study of the prison industrial complex. The books written by Steve Praisel help people understand how the criminalization of certain actions and the prison system affect society as a whole. Study of the media and its representation of crime. Steve Praisel's books are controversial and have been represented in the media in various ways. Study of the impact of government policies on individuals. The books written by Steve Praisel help people understand how government policies affect them and their families. Study of the intersectionality of issues. The books written by Steve Praisel help people understand how issues like freedom of speech, drug policy, and social inequality affect society as a whole. Additionally, owning a book does not mean endorsing or promoting its content. It is a way of understanding and studying the subject. It's important to remember that watching or listening to true crime, like podcasts about Bruce McArthur, can have a big effect on the communities where these crimes happen. It's also important to think about how this kind of content affects your morals and the impact it may have on the victims and their families. Steve Praisel's writing, while controversial, did not directly cause harm to society. The books do not promote violence, and the book's impact on society is limited to the possession of the book and not actual criminal activities. In short, Bruce McArthur's actions were very bad and hurt society a lot, while Steve Praisel's writing, though controversial, didn't hurt society in any direct way. Based on the statistics, it would stand to reason that the very people who saw the worst in the accused without directly inquiring with him, despite his presence in the room, themselves could be argued to have engaged in much more odd behaviors by actively seeking out these podcasts every week. It's important to note that owning these books does not mean endorsing or promoting their content. It's a way of understanding and studying the subject. These books can be found on Amazon, online, and in used bookstores, and some are more rare and valuable. For social science students, they provide valuable insights and perspectives that cannot be found elsewhere. The ownership of these books versus the consumption of true crime and murder podcasts, such as those about the case of Bruce McArthur, however different, come from the same place of curiosity. It would not be reasonable to jump to such conclusions as, if one were to be caught listening to a murder podcast, they intended to study these to become a murderer. Nor would you assume if this was in conjunction with having found several 8-inch knives, knives with specialized blades, and several larger sharpened knives, which have been displayed in a specialized block of wood and stored most conveniently on the kitchen counter, that these individuals may pose a risk to society and require a forensic psychological evaluation that will ultimately determine if they should be institutionalized. On the other hand, the ownership of Steve Praisel's books, while controversial, does not directly cause harm to society. They provide valuable insights and perspectives on various social and political issues. The book's impact on society is limited to possession of the book and not to actual criminal activities. Owning Steve Praisel's books does not justify being assumed to be harmful to society. On the other hand, if people tried to understand these problems instead of being afraid of them, they might be able to see valuable insights and perspectives on different social and political problems more clearly. This could lead to more compassion and positive changes in society. Had his crimes been violent and gruesome, we may not be here today for this discussion. Many would have copies of these books, making it normal and acceptable. That is, upon the first podcast appearance. In conclusion, as a student of social science, the ownership of the series of books written by Steve Praisel is a valuable and justifiable addition to one's academic research as they provide unique insights and perspectives on various social and political issues. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope to have inspired inquiry into our viewers' thoughts and beliefs, and we look forward to your comments below. Take care, and thank you again for keeping an open mind. Your support in the quest for positive drug policy reform is always appreciated.